All right, so Mendel and laws of heredity. Let's see. All right, there was this guy, and his name was Gregor Mendel. Obviously, you can tell he's fairly old. He comes from way back. But this guy is said to be the father of genetics, and he was an Austrian monk. And he basically stayed at a monastery, and he spent a lot of time experimenting with pea plants. You're going to hear quite a bit about Gregor Mendel and his experiments with pea plants. And he is the developer of the information that was used to work with Punnett squares. Now, y'all might have seen these before. Y'all might have seen them in maybe middle school or something like that. It's, you know, a square, and you'll have a parent on top, and then, you know, another parent over here, and then you have to fill these things out. You might have seen something like that before. All right, but this is the guy who invented all of this, and his name is Gregor Mendel. Like I say, they do quote him as being the father of genetics. Now, if you've ever heard of genetics before, it's literally, you know, the passing on of traits from parents to offspring. So he figured out all of that stuff, but he did so by doing his experiments with pea plants. All right, so Mendel and his experiments with these pea plants. He did many experiments to determine the passing of traits from parents to offspring. And again, like I say, he did it with these pea plants. You can see all these different characteristics down here. And for most of our class, we're going to focus on simple dominant recessive traits. And just FYI, what that means, for it to be either simple dominant recessive, that means it'll be either be one thing or it'll be the other, right? That's the easiest way to remember what it means to be simple dominant recessive, is it'll either be one thing or the other. There's really no in between, right? And here's some of the actual characteristics that he studied. He studied the actual form of the seed, the color of the flowers that were produced, the form and the color of the pea pod, and then he looked at certain stem characteristics. Now, you can see from the results, the seed could either be round or wrinkled, right? So it's one or the other. The flower colors could be white or purple. The pod could either be full or constricted. Y'all might have even seen these before when y'all look at pea pods. And some of y'all have even probably had to shell peas before. I don't know, maybe y'all got some grandparents that have done that. The pod could be yellow or it could be green. And then he looked at certain positions of the flowers on the plant. The flowers could be axial, which means it kind of comes from closer to the stem, or they could be terminal, which means they come at the end of the stem. All right, and then some pea plants were tall and then some were short. But these are all just basically traits, right? He studies these traits in pea plants, and he would actually allow these plants to pollinate each other, and then they would produce seeds, and then he would plant these seeds and look at what traits the offspring had to determine which thing would be dominant or recessive, right? So it's not that complex of a concept. All right, now here's some general terms you guys need to be familiar with. I'll just go ahead and mark all these: genetics, heredity, and then characteristics. All right, so for our purposes, genetics is the study of heredity, right? Heredity is the passing on of traits from parents to offspring. And then these traits that are passed from parents to offspring, these would be called characteristics. So these traits are literally characteristics, and they are traits that are passed from parents to offspring. They could be things like eye color, hair color, height, skin color, etc. All of these things are genetically coded for in our DNA. And you know, you get half of your DNA comes from your mom, and the other half of your DNA obviously has to come from your father. And when they pass these things on, either your mother's traits or your father's traits will be dominant. Some of them can be recessive. And then sometimes, you know, you can have multiple traits, and then some of your mother's traits be dominant, and then some of your father's traits be dominant, right? So that is possible also, because each individual trait is inherited independently of another one. Just because you have your mother's eye color, right, doesn't mean that you will have your mother's hair color or facial features, et cetera, et cetera. Each trait is inherited independently. Here's some other terms you need to be familiar with from this section. Gametes, these are big terms, by the way. These will show up quite a bit on the EOC. You need to know what a gamete is, since we are talking about heredity and passing on of traits from parents to offspring. You need to know that gametes are sex cells, and that includes sperm and egg cells. In plants, it would be pollen, right? So if you're talking about an animal, it'll be sperm and egg cells. And if it's plant, it would be pollen. Now, when these two come together, that process is called fertilization, right? So literally you'll have a sperm cell, and then it will come together with a female egg cell. That process right there is called fertilization. And the original cell that is formed when those two come together is called the zygote. It is the original single cell or the fertilized egg cell. And this is what we actually all started as, by the way. We all started as a zygote. And then that cell went through the process of mitosis, and it made many, many, many identical copies from one parent cell, right? You might remember that. And then over time, it developed into an embryo because it kept going through mitosis and kept growing. And then it eventually became a fetus, and then it became an entire little baby. And then that's what we grew from. All right, so, we're going to talk about two different crosses here. We're going to talk about something called a monohybrid cross and a dihybrid cross. And they're not that complex, so don't be overwhelmed by them, but these two things will definitely show up on the EOC. And I want you to get the general idea of what's going on with these Punnett squares and these crosses, because we'll actually apply these theories or these little common bonds all the way through chapter 12. So make sure you get a good foundational understanding of these monohybrid crosses or this Punnett square stuff for now. All right. So a monohybrid cross is a cross that literally compares the passing on of a single trait. And that should make sense anyway, because if you remember the prefix mono, that means one. So we're only really looking at one trait. Organisms are only different by one trait, so it's easy to trace. All right, so on this left side, the trait that we're looking at, or that Mendel, I guess you could say, looked at, we would be looking at the pod color, right? The pod color would either be green or it would be yellow. On this side, you're looking at obviously eye color. Eye color would either be brown, and I'm guessing these little bees most likely mean blue, all right? Now, usually when you draw Punnett squares, you have one parent on top and then one parent on the side. Those will be your parents. Everything else that is in the middle, that one, that one, that one, and that one, are all possible offspring, right? These are all possible babies from these two parents. And hopefully you're able to recognize too that every individual has two of these little letters that represents their genetic makeup, right? Now that should make sense because every person, and I always want you to remember this, every person is made up from two people, right? Their mom and their dad. So everybody has to have at least two alleles or two letters for every trait. One of those letters came from your mom and the other one came from your dad, right? This person here, this parent, right, obviously had one parent that had brown eyes, right? But the other parent had blue eyes. And now they are said to have a combination of both. However, one of them is dominant, right? You see this person has brown eyes. Well, usually dominant letters are written as capital letters. Recessive letters means it would be a lowercase letter. All right? And it actually ends up being hidden or masked by the dominant trait, right? And this person, well, both of their parents most likely had brown eyes. So that's why they have a combination of two dominant letters. All right. Now you can go back and watch these on your own time if you want to. That's really up to you. They could be beneficial for you. But now, anyway, you know, Gregor Mendel did all this work with these pea plants, and he compared all of these things, and he learned some standards. He learned some true facts about this simple dominant recessive heredity. And he learned, okay, from his work with simple dominant recessive heredity, he learned that each organism is represented by 2 letters, which is kind of what I just told you, right? You can either be big T, you could be big T, or you could be little t, right? Now that's the same as that previous slide, just FYI. They're just using a different letter, right? You can be big B, you could be big B, or you could have been little b. The letter doesn't matter. What matters is what combinations do you have, and whether or not it's big B, big B, or little b. It's all about the type of combination you have, and then what those letters stand for. Okay, so don't worry so much about whether or not it's A, T, S, R. Nobody cares about that. All right, and now each one of these letters that you see right here, big T, big T, little t, each one of those letters is something called an allele, right? So this one right here has 2 alleles. This one has 2 alleles. This one has 2 alleles. And in each situation, one of those alleles comes from the mother and the other one came from the father. All right, so I mean, we were able to figure that out ourselves. All right, now to further on that information, you'll either have a dominant trait or a recessive trait. The dominant trait is the observed trait that you see in the offspring, and it will be represented with a capital letter. All right, so if we were to go back to that, just say this Punnett square here, if you take a brown-eyed person and a brown-eyed person, obviously these are all the offspring. So I would say that the dominant trait would have been having brown eyes, right? Because that's the thing that most of our offspring had. So to me, that would be the dominant trait, right? If you go back here, you see that it says the recessive trait is the trait that is hidden or masked in the offspring, and it will be represented by a lowercase letter. So if we went back and looked at that one, well, I'd say that the trait that is hidden is that blue-eyed person, right, or blue eyes. So that means blue eyes would be recessive, and then obviously since the majority of the offspring have brown eyes, I'd say 4 out of 4 here, brown eyes would be the dominant trait. Here in this situation, you know, you've got this big Y and little y. Big Y obviously means it has a yellow pod. So in this current offspring, like if I was just going to look at these two, I would say, well, yellow must be the dominant trait. And this offspring here has a combination of a dominant allele and a recessive allele. But that dominant allele hides the recessive allele, and you only end up seeing the dominant trait, which is having a yellow pod. Same thing happens with this offspring. Now, for you to actually show a recessive trait, right, for you to show a recessive trait, you have to have a combination of 2 recessive alleles. All right, that's the only way you will ever show a recessive trait. You will always show a dominant trait. If you just say you could be big B, you would show the dominant trait. Big B, little b, you would still show the dominant trait because that dominant allele will mask that recessive allele. The only way you would show a recessive trait is if you have 2 recessive B's or T's or R's or whatever letter. The letter doesn't matter. It's all about how they're combined. So just FYI, in this situation, a blue-eyed person would have had to have been little b. That's the only way a person would have had blue eyes. All right, now there is something else called the law of segregation. That did come from Mendels' work with dihybrid crosses. So let me tell you what this is real quick. The law of segregation, if you know what the word segregate means, it means for people to separate, right? And when a parent creates a sperm or an egg cell, they only donate half of their DNA to you, all right? So when gametes are produced, such as sperm and eggs, parents will only donate 1 of their alleles, right? That means that their 2 alleles, your parents' 2 alleles, must separate to create a sperm or an egg cell. So here's basically what it's saying. If I drew a Punnett square again, like we just had it, right? And I had that parent, that brown-eyed parent and that other brown-eyed parent. what it's saying here is for these parents to create that offspring, their alleles have to separate, right? It can't, both big B's can't go in this box. Only this one will go in that box. This big B has to separate from the little b, just like that one did, to create that offspring. Oh, excuse me, I actually drew that wrong. That should be another big B, right? So this allele has to separate from that one, and this allele will separate from this one to create that offspring. All right, so I mean, it just kind of makes sense. I mean, you know, if your parents have 46 chromosomes, when they create a sperm or an egg cell, they have to create something that has 23, so that when they come back together through fertilization to create that zygote, you'll be back to 46, right? And the only way that happens is if their chromosomes or their genes or their all that stuff separates and they only donate half. All right. Now here's some big words for you also, phenotypes and genotypes. The easiest way to remember the difference between these is when you see phenotype, think about the way that the word starts, PH, right? And kind of try to remember that that is the physical appearance of something. That is actually how it will look. That's the easiest way to remember that. The phenotype is the physical appearance of an organism. That could, and you usually describe the physical appearance of an organism with some type of word. It is either tall or short. It is round or wrinkled. It produces flowers that are purple or white, right? And the genotype is the combination of alleles that an organism has. So this is more or less talking about the genetics, and this is talking about the physical appearance. Now, there are 3 words that are associated with genotypes, and you need to remember what each one means. Right now, I like to use prefixes. I'm going to use homo, and then hetero. Anytime you see the prefix homo, right, that means the same. That means something is the same. And you see homo dominant. Right, and matter of fact, let me go back and make sure I use the same color here. You see homo dominant. Dominant means capital letters. That means it's the dominant allele. You're going to write with a dominant allele or a dominant letter, and both letters will be the same. So if you see the prefix or you see the phrase homozygous dominant, then you're going to be dealing with situations where the alleles are both capital letters and the same. Now, if you know what the prefix hetero means, that means that things are different, right? So in this situation, you have alleles, right? This situation where one is dominant and then one is recessive. One is dominant, one is recessive. And then finally here you have homozygous recessive. It's basically the opposite of homozygous dominant, right? In homozygous dominant, both of them are capital. In homozygous recessive, both of them are lowercase, right? So if I was to just say, give me a heterozygous genotype, right? Well, you can pick any letter. The letter don't matter. We'll use A, right? That would be heterozygous. You just say another letter, say M. Well, that would be heterozygous. If I said, give me both of these in a homozygous dominant form, well, that would be AA, and then this would be big M, big M. Then if I said, give it to me in a homozygous recessive form, well, that would be little a, and then little m, little m. All right, so you do need to know what these words mean and then how they're related to a genotype. Now, again, the letter doesn't matter. It's all about how the combinations are or what kind of combination you have. Now, Mendel did go on to develop something called a dihybrid cross. For your purposes on the EOC, you will not need to know much about a dihybrid cross other than a relative ratio. That ratio that I want you to associate with a dihybrid cross is a ratio of 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. The 9 things that you will see will be the most dominant things, right? The 1 thing you see will be the thing that is most likely to be recessive, okay? And he also found out that traits can be inherited independently from one another. I kind of mentioned that earlier. I told you just because you have your mom's eye color doesn't mean you're going to have your mom's hair color. So traits are inherited independently. And what that means is, I think they call that the law of independent assortment. So just be aware of that. And here's kind of what, I guess, an example of the dihybrid cross. Now that it's a dihybrid cross, we're actually looking at two traits. So we're actually looking at the fur color of the cat. It's either going to be brown or white. And then we're looking at the length of the tail. So that is the second trait we're looking at. That makes it a dihybrid situation. Right, now you see here brown is dominant. So I think in this image it shows you a brown cat mates with a white cat, and then all of their offspring are brown. Well, that should kind of signal to you that brown is going to be the dominant trait. So if you know that, then you know brown is written with a capital B, and then white would be written with a lowercase b. Right? You wouldn't use W there. Okay, you don't use different letters when you start talking about a trait. The only thing that matters is whether or not you have, whatever's dominant, just pick a letter and let it be capital. Whatever's recessive, pick that same letter and just let it be lowercase. All right. Then you'll see one cat had a long tail. You see this cat had a long tail, and then this had a short tail. You'll notice all of the offspring tails are short. So that tells you that the short tail is dominant to the long tail. All right. Now I think what they did, here's where you get to the dihybrid cross part, is they allowed these offspring to have babies. And then this is their second generation. This is the first generation, this is the second generation. When you get to the second generation in a dihybrid cross, there are 16 possible outcomes. You will see 9 animals that have both dominant traits, right? Brown and short tail. Then you will see 3 organisms, right, that will have 1 recessive and 1 dominant trait, or 1 recessive and 1 dominant trait. You will see 3 of that nature, then you'll see 3 of that nature, right? And then you will only have 1 organism that has all recessive traits, right? But just kind of remember this ratio, 9 to 3 to 3 to 1. I think that might pop up maybe one time on the EOC, but other than that, it's just not too dominant on the test. So just be aware of that.